Hi, everyone. Welcome to Engaging User Experiences with Google App Engine. My name is John Skidgel. I'm a UI designer at Google, and I work on the front end for App Engine. I work on the admin console, and I also work on the Google Application Launcher, which just shipped a couple weeks ago for Mac OS X.
I'm Lindsey Simon. I'm a developer on the UX team for Google, obviously. And John and I work together on the admin console. And so we thought we'd try to get together and talk about how we work together on it, both in terms of how designers and developers work together, but App Engine specifically. The admin console, if you don't know, is an App Engine app. So it represented a really good opportunity for us to kind of document and think about how we worked together. And we thought we'd share some of that with you.
Okay, so what we're going to cover. As Lindsey just said, we're going to cover the designer-developer workflow and sort of talk about how it's a relationship. We're going to talk about authentication, when and how you should do it. We're going to talk about latency, because Google is always thinking about latency and how it affects user experience. And then we're going to talk about defensive enhancement, which is another way of spinning progressive enhancement. And we're going to cover all of this as we rebuild the sample app that ships with the SDK. It's the Guestbook app. And you can get all the sample code at this URL that's at the bottom. So before I start, I just want to ask 4 quick questions. So how many people in the room consider themselves a developer? Okay. How many people consider themselves a designer?
See, we want you guys. And part of that is when we started talking about it, well, we'll get to this, but you're kind of in demand, you designers.
So the 4th question is none of the above, neither a designer nor a developer. Okay.
Cool.
Great.
And just how many of you have used App Engine or know App Engine generally at this point? Okay, good. Because we're not really going to cover it, but we're going to talk about it.
Okay, so if you're not familiar with the Guestbook, I'm just going to show a couple screenshots and then show you a screenshot of what we did. So this is the existing Guestbook app. It's a really simple web app where you've got a text field and a button, and as you add in comments, they get added to this Guestbook. So what we did is we spruced it up a little bit, and in addition to some design, we allowed people to create multiple Guestbooks, and we did a little defensive enhancement with Ajax. And then we also did some things around improving latency.
Yeah, and you want to give a quick demo?
So I'll give you a quick demo.
The idea with the Guestbook is if you were going to make this for App Engine, you'd want to make it so other applications could use this software embedded on their site. So there's one level of relationship. In other words, a website belongs to an owner, and you make Guestbook posts to a Guestbook for a particular website, just if that's not clear.
So this is the Google App Engine Launcher for Mac OS X. I'm just going to run this app. So when I click Run, it's going to load the application in Safari, all running on localhost. And so this is the app here. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go through and add a website. And Lindsey's going to sort of talk while I do things.
Yeah, so this application, if you get a chance to look at the code, it uses Django on top of Google App Engine. You can use any Python framework with App Engine, but we use Django for this just to make some of the easy things really easy. So this is a Django form. App Engine ships with this module. Django Forms is we've written it to work in App Engine specifically, but it's got all of the things like form validation and whatever. So this isn't particularly interesting. But what's interesting here is that notice John didn't sign in before he filled out the form, and so we're going to talk about that. So he just signed in, and presumably here you'd have some message that's like, hey, now you're signed in, now you can save the form. So now he's made a website for Google, and now he can sign the Guestbook, and there's this link up top. But instead of the link going to a form, we do the form inline. So this is just kind of the context around how we're going to talk about engaging user experiences with App Engine. I don't think we're trying to say this is an awesome app, but the point is just it shows a couple of ways you can build an app with App Engine so that you can make your app awesome and think about these things. Okay, yeah, so this last year at South by Southwest, I was attending a panel with Simon Willison, who was speaking, and he's one of the co-authors of Django and works a lot on OpenID, and I'd seen him speak a few times, and he started talking about how, he was engaging, he was trying to tell the audience that he really was looking for a design husband. And I thought this was really funny because, here's this guy who I admire as a developer and as a programmer, and, he's not looking for other developers to work with him. He's really trying to find a designer. And working at Google, I have the luxury of meeting people like John. I want to work with a good designer too. And so we thought about that as like, I have a design husband. If I want to work on a project at Google, I'm going to work on it with John because I want help with design. It's not something that I'm trained to do. I can think about it, but I'm not trained to do it. And I don't, typically do it for every project if it was just me. But when you have this available to you, it's a resource that's really awesome. And so we wanted to talk about how, what would you look for? If you were looking for a design husband, I was like, well, what's Simon mean? And I kind of know what he means. But so we thought we'd couch it in terms of like, classifieds, because I used to work at newspapers. So when I'm looking for a designer, what do I mean? And for me, it's like, I don't want the sort of what I imagine as the whiny designer. I want someone who I can work with, not someone who's going to give me Photoshop files who I just go implement it from scratch, right? Like I want someone I can work with on a project. And so, like I say, I don't want this sort of Andy Warhol type designer. I want someone who's scrappy, who's kind of well-rounded. Like I say, you're not afraid to look at code because, you can't really have a meaningful design for these kinds of applications anymore if you really want to separate, strict visual design and interaction design from the act of engineering it. That's not really a productive workflow. It can be done, and I think people do this in large companies or where it's available, but for you guys out there, or if you're, in a smaller environment, take advantage of this. Be upfront about it. You want to work with your designer. And from the beginning, it's really important.
So the flip side of this relationship, you definitely, as a designer, when you work at companies, I've worked at a lot of the Silicon Valley companies, and you really want, if you're a designer and you're looking for a place to work or you're looking for someone to partner with, you really want to find someone who's, very sane, customer-focused, and has good communication skills. And so, as a developer, you should, have like a crocodile skin, just take suggestions without going ballistic. Have some appreciation for aesthetics, even if you're not trained with the design, just appreciate, what, good design, good user experience. And then, Lindsey, I think, is, a really rare breed because he has a really deep and broad understanding of not only the front-end issues like HTML, JavaScript, CSS, but he also back-end issues like writing queries and writing handlers and all that sort of thing. And then lastly, like Lindsey said, it's a collaboration. So you shouldn't feel that your designer has full reign over the design. Go up to a whiteboard, sketch out a flow. If you're sort of accustomed to like diagramming your models and things like that, doing flow isn't really that much different. It's just adding some some cases and conditionals and things like that.
So if you're one of either of us two in these slides, look at the other one and try to be that way. So, when John says try to be sane and customer focused, I think designers appreciate that more than developers typically. So I try to actually think about that when working with designers. Okay, put my head in a customer focused mode a little bit because designers are thinking about that. And more as I'm usually thinking about immediately the technical solution to a problem. So it turns out to be more productive to try to think outside of your own, comfort zone. So we were going to talk about how App Engine as a platform is good for this kind of workflow because it turned out to be really good for us and doing the admin console. John's a Mac guy, and he's comfortable on the command line, but it's not his favorite environment, and it's mine. So when he started working on the App Engine launcher, I thought, oh, this is awesome because if you do work with designers. Looking at the designers I see where I work, they all are Mac people, and these aren't typically people who love the command line approach to putting the port flag on the command line. This excites me, and it kind of drives them away. So App Engine turns out to, because there is this App Engine launcher, give this to your designers. Have them actually run the application locally. I have several other projects I work on in my spare time as a developer, and the relationship's totally different. What you do today to develop a web application typically, or I'll tell you what I do. I have an Apache build that I've compiled. It has a couple of custom modules with a local database of geolocation. It has a very specific version of PHP with very specific modules enabled. And I can go on, but you're starting to get the idea. The HTTP conf is very special. It runs a virtual host. It enables mod rewrite. I know how to set this up on Ubuntu in 20 minutes, but I don't think I can set it up on a Mac in 20 minutes. So this is the environment I have today. And so the way I work with designers on those kinds of projects is totally different. They send me Photoshop files. They take screenshots. Maybe they'll take a source and edit something, but rarely. So they don't even feel empowered to touch the HTML. They certainly don't feel empowered to look at the JavaScript because it's compiled. They don't feel empowered to change even the CSS. And most designers today are pretty competent with CSS, if not better than a lot of developers. So this is where you want them to help you. And if you've got a build system that's impossible to replicate on their local machine, I mean, think about that's the first thing you do when you develop a web app, right? You set up the system on your local machine, but designers haven't ever been doing that. It's really rare. So I think App Engine that's one of the ways in which it's really different. Getting set up and getting started and having your designer with the same environment you have, I mean, the bar's pretty low. There's Subversion. They might have to install Python if it's not on their machine, though Python's pretty commonly on most machines now by default. Worst case scenario, they have to install 1 or 2 modules in Python that aren't there. But this is a very low bar compared to writing an HTTP conf, installing, understanding mod rewrite maybe, running something on a port. I mean, this is much easier. And so I think that, for you guys, that's one thing to consider in terms of collaboration. As this as a platform is really different in that way.
So that said, we're going to show you the 3D flywheel of product development, and I don't mean 3D as in three-dimensional space, but 3D is in design, develop, and deploy. And this is really an iterative flywheel. It's like, we're constantly, we start out doing design, but, then we go into develop. We might go back to design. We'll deploy something really quickly. We'll test it. We'll test the code. We like to do usability testing, that sort of thing. So I just wanted to give you a quick overview of the things that we do in each of these phases. So in design, you'll do research. You'll go out and talk to customers. You'll find out what they want. That's something we did when we designed the admin console. You do flows. So again, you get a whiteboard. This can be really informal. I'll show you some examples in a few seconds. Then you wireframe it. I'll show examples of that. And then, your designer gets into Photoshop or Fireworks or whatever and starts to do screen design. You then start developing. And actually developing can actually start as soon as you do your flows. So as soon as we write our flows, Lindsey can very quickly start writing his handlers and, creating models. So, the developed stuff you're probably all familiar with. You have the stuff that you do on the back end. You have stuff that you do on the front end. I would just say, remember, to use version control. And then, then you deploy. So, you build stuff. You want to have good optimization scripts. Make your JavaScript and CSS really small, and then you deploy. And as you probably have seen, if you're familiar with App Engine, deploying is really simple.
And since this is an iterative process here, and that's why it's the wheel, right? With the one technology of version control here and the ease of the local environment, this is something that we can iterate on together. And it's not John sends me an email, I go away, I code it, I run a local server and tell him to hit that server. I just say SVN up, and I can go disappear, and he can SVN up and run it on his machine and see, find the details I've missed. I mean, this is normal. Developers miss some of the little details. That's just the way it goes. But we're trying to, usually build the technology and the details. So it's nice because designers, I think right now, even at Google we have this problem. They want to make really small changes. And the bar to make these really small changes is quite high because they have to build oftentimes, and sometimes that means a lot of compilation. And I mean, this is probably all very obvious, but it's something that I'm often very thankful about in this development cycle that we can really take advantage of. That's not always the case in web app development.
So let's talk about some of the things we did to make this little sample app was here. So first we started out doing design flows, and it's really important to do together. Like I said, the developer should feel comfortable going to a whiteboard, sketching out flows, and this is just something you guys do together. Note that it's iterative. It doesn't have to be completely formal. You don't have to write huge, crazy specs for features. You can go in a room, bang something out, and then just start designing and making it. The last thing is, capture these things. Use a digicam, pull out your iPhone, do whatever it takes. Get this stuff captured, And it's just a really quick way to start to document your design. So for was here, we started out, took us about an hour to kind of quickly wireframe and flow this small application. So we're like, okay, we're going to need a home page. We're going to need an index of all the sites that have been added. We'll have to have a specific page for each site. We'll need a screen to basically add a greeting to the site. We'll have a page for adding the site. Maybe we'll have an about page. And some of these things will require sign-in. And then, we started to wireframe. And then we came back to the flow and said, hey, we need these continue URLs. So like when someone signs a guest book, where do they go? Well, they go back to the site view. Or let's say that they add their own site. Well, we should dump them in the site view. So, you do these things and you think you've got it all thought out, but then when you start to actually develop or maybe make the wireframes, then you come back to this and you want to update these things.
And otherwise, too, two heads are better than one when you do this. Some of it seemed really obvious. Like, I thought, oh, okay, we're going to make a guest book app. I basically know what to do, right? My inclination is just go and start programming it. And this is not really the best way to do stuff. It's much better to get together with someone. And if it's a designer, you're going to be much better off. But, and to actually talk it through. And his handwriting's 10 times better than mine, and I can read all of these things. So, the pictures are actually meaningful. If I look at the drivel that I create when I try to document stuff before I'm going to code it, it's not quite as useful. This was useful, throughout. I could always come back and re-reference this.
Okay, and so then we did some wireframes. So we just took each page, did a very rough schematic of all the content that would be on each page. We did that, and then basically there were some things where we thought, well, where would Ajax be a nice sort of piece of sugar to each page? So we thought, oh yeah, maybe we could have some of the pagination use Ajax, or maybe sign in could be done with Ajax, all those sorts of things. So then basically, once this is done, it's not like I go off and I'm just designing and then Lindsey's kind of twiddling his thumbs. We both have enough information to basically get started and start running, basically both doing our tasks. I'm basically going out and starting to create all the assets, the mocks, the logos, the whatever else, and Lindsey's basically he's starting to write Python.
Okay, so we're going to talk about authentication a little bit, and so we're going to talk about the users API in App Engine because it really makes the act of doing authentication much easier. You'll notice when you create an app, there's two kinds of authentication. There's wide Google account style authentication, and then you can use Google Apps for your domain. So if you have a domain and you only want users of that domain to have access to this app, that's supported right out of the box. So this is already a pretty nice feature of App Engine and something to take advantage of. But it's not necessary. You can make your own authentication system. You can use another. You can leverage OpenID. There's a lot of examples we have up on the code.google.com site to walk you through how to do this. So don't try to start from scratch. Look at what's already there. And but in terms of authentication, really what I want to talk about is our next slide, which is when to authenticate. Okay, it's a great thing that you can make authentication easy, but as a developer, I went away and I was like, okay, cool. I just put the hook here when we want authentication, send them to log in, right? But there's more you can think about here than that. It's more than that. Think about the flow of users on your application. Think about its design. Does authentication really need to gate people at every stage where you want them to sign in? And that's something that when we started looking at the flows, it became a little more obvious where we should not make it a gating factor. And really, what it boils down to is you don't have to authorize until you need to save data that is perhaps something that you need to tie to a user. And so looking at the very simple model for our greeting and our website, that was very obvious. It's only when you need to save data that actually has a user object in it. Okay, cool. You need the user object. That's when you authenticate. Here in this application, we actually use the App Engine data store to store session data. And in Django, there's a built-in session module. And there are examples of how to use this session module in Google App Engine up also in the code site. And there's an example built into this app if you download it. So I would say, use something that makes the act of setting the user's cookie really easy and take advantage of the session. And in fact, we're probably going to improve this session module to use memcache because session is it's a sort of data that you really want to keep close to the user. You don't really need to store it indefinitely. It's a very short time frame. Once they're done on your application, you can get rid of this data. It's temporal to them using it. So Memcache turns out to be probably a really good place for this. And I'd say look for that or talk to me afterwards. This is something I want to do, and I just wanted to mention it. So I kind of want to walk you through some of this code. Maybe I can point. I don't know if it's necessary, but I've got a laser pointer, so I kind of can't help it. So I just wanted to show you what the code looks like in this case. This is a handler, which is taking the act of saving. In other words, it's the website create handler, and it handles get and post. In Django, these are it's just a request parameter here. So I'm looking if the request is a post up top, and if it's a post, I'm going to take the post data. Otherwise, I'm looking in the session to see if I've ever saved anything in the session with this key, website form. And if I have, I'm going to load that. I'm going to get form data. And notice here that I'm using pickle to load it, and I'm going to explain that down below. But we're just getting it out of session, and we're unpickling it, basically. Form data here, otherwise, is none. And then I create this form object. This is a Django idiom here. But I'm just feeding it one variable, form data. And the instance is the website, and this is my model. So down here, so let's assume they get past this, right? And they've clicked save. In other words, this is a post request. And I've handled a get request elsewhere. So there should be little dots here. There's more in this handler. But here, if the user's none, I actually take the entire post and I can pickle it. And pickling is just Python serialization. So if you're familiar with serializing in PHP, basically I'm creating a string. I'm just turning an object, in this case it's a query decked object, and turning it into a string that I can store in session, or basically store in the data store. So I can give it a key, store it, and then now I'll send them to log in. And then the login includes a continue URL. So maybe John can sign out from our demo and kind of walk you through this. I mean, I don't know if I explained it when we did it, but just to talk through it. But the reasoning here is, right, it seems obvious, right? You don't need to have them log in until they've filled in the form. And this is a very important user experience thing, because originally we just made you log in before we showed you the form. But if you've got an interesting form, and if, in fact, people hate forms, right? You guys know this. Nobody likes to sign up. Nobody likes to sign in. Nobody likes to register. It's just a hassle. So get them to do something on your site. Like, make this form fun and interesting, and this is the reason they're there. This is their train of thought. Let them get their train of thought out. Get their data in your system, and then tell them they need to sign in. And store their data. Hold it onto it for them. Say, hey, give them a nice message, somewhere in between here. This is just local development. But tell them, hey, we've got your data. It's safe. Now you need to either create a user account for yourself or sign in, but we'll bring you back and you'll have all your data. And it's two things there. One, you've made their experience great. You've got them engaged. You've got them to see your application in action. And, they've gone full circle. You've given them a reason to sign up. If you're making a social app, no one wants to create sign-ups or do this, right? You know that. So let them fill in the form. Now they probably want to sign up and save their data. So in that way, that's how we thought we'd sort of couch this as a user experience thing.
Okay. So you want to go next?
Okay. It could have. I guess here, you could obviously do whatever you want. In this case, we're just bringing you back to the form to say, hey, you should probably also have a message up top that says, hey, you've signed in. We're giving you another chance to look at it, but all your data's there. I think the question there is, yeah, I mean, you could post it. It's just what you want to do with it. In this case, App Engine, when you do authentication, it redirects you back to where you were. So it's automatically taking you back to website/create. And I could check and cause a redirect here to be a post. I didn't do it, but because I wanted to demonstrate the process. Okay, so I guess the next slide, right? Oh yeah, that's on here. Okay, so latency.
Want me to drive for you?
Yeah, you can drive for me.
Okay.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about latency here, because there's some features in App Engine that you can leverage to make a web app's front end a little bit better. And since that's something I focus on a lot, I wanted to share some of those tricks with you. In general, I don't know if you saw Steve Souders talk about making your website faster, but it's a pretty common place nowadays to think about, if you have a lot of CSS files and a lot of JavaScript files, which is generally good practice. You don't want these all in one file. But when it comes time to put this up on your final website, you want to put them all together so that there's one GET request for this asset, and so that your users can cache that asset in their browser. And so there's a couple ways we can take advantage of that. Here, I have a link to a deploy script. We could look at it if you guys want to, but it's just code. The idea is it's just going to concatenate all the CSS files in my directory, and it's going to run it through. In that example, it's using Yahoo's minifier. So it's going to remove white space. It's going to remove semicolons where it can. It's going to make it generally smaller. And this is the act of deploying. And then it's, in my case, this deploy script does all this magic. Then it SVN commits, and then it runs the app config update. So this is like a one-script deploy to Google App Engine. It's pretty simple. In terms of file fingerprinting, Steve talks about this a lot. But if you look at Yahoo's assets or Google's assets, there's a lot of ways in which we'll take advantage of the browser's caching. So if you have, at the end, you've put all your CSS files together or your JavaScript files together, and you've got this compiled.js file. Really what you want is for your users to have some sense of version when they ask for this file. So you want them to ask for compiled.1.2.js. And then what you want to serve them is the file on your web server's file system, compiled.js. So in the Apache world, the way you do this is you use mod rewrite to recognize that they're asking for a version number, and then give them the other file on the file system. So we want to do the same thing in App Engine. There's a couple other things you'll want to do there. Notice, so I'm mentioning expires headers. Another thing that will make your browser hold on to this file as long as possible is to say, okay, if they ask for compiled 1.24.js, give them 1.24.js and tell the browser to hold on to that thing for 10 years. It's never going to change. So they'll never ask. You're trying to do as many things as you can to make them never ask for the same file again. You want them to keep this file on their system. So those are two tricks to trying to do that in multiple browsers. So I'm going to show you the code that does this. Actually, this is a second part of the slide. No, go ahead. Here, I just want to show a way to actually tell whether you're on the local dev app server or whether you're in production, because that tells you how you might want to do things. So in a local build here, I'm setting by default my build to production, and then looking for a string key in the server_software environment variable. So this is one of the first things you want to do in a generic handler is figure out where you are. And if you're on the local dev app server, set it to development. And so I'm saying, I'm setting a parameter just called build that I can pass to my templates. Then in my template where I have CSS that's going to go into the head tag, I actually look, okay, am I on my local environment? If I am, output every CSS file individually because I don't care about performance when I'm testing locally. In fact, it's easier. If I'm debugging it and something's wrong, I can figure out more easily how to get to the source of the problem. But if I'm in production, I want to output a link to this awesome compiled versioned CSS file. And so down here, this second one, this is a feature that's relatively new. And there's now an environment variable in the app server called current version ID. So this is the 1.24 that I'm alluding to. You can get the version number. Every time you deploy, there's a new version number. And locally, the version number doesn't matter. So what you care about is the production version number. So you can leverage this version ID in your templates. You can use this for image assets because you can just append some number to put it in your templates. Every time you have an image request, I'd say, /image/ myimage dot current version ID dot JPEG. And so the request is going to come to the app server with this version ID. So now you need to ignore this version ID. How do you do that? So the next slide, this is your YAML file, your app.yaml. And here, I've got this first line is a bunch of lovely regex. And I love regex. It's I'm saying I'm looking for every request that comes in that looks like, in this first example, /js and /was for was here, .1.24.js. So it sends down the file that I've created in build time, static JS was.js. And I'm sending an expires header of 10 years from today. And these are the recommendations that Steve's come up with from testing this a lot, to set it 10 years in the future and give it a version ID. So you don't have to maintain multiple versions of these files on your file system. You can do this in your build. And down below, this is just a catch-all. So if you don't want to put a version ID on a static resource, there it is. But notice this. So this will work for JavaScript, CSS, or any of your image assets. And it's pretty generic and pretty simple. And this would capture any URL requests before they get to your front-side controller. All right, so this is the somewhat anti-GWT part of the talk, to talk about defensive enhancement. And I say that sort of humorously because there's a talk about earlier, if you guys saw the keynote, the GWT team is, they're making a lot of, they can take your app and make it all in JavaScript. And that's cool, but I want to talk a little bit about when you're making an app, that's not a full-blown, crazy drawing JavaScript app. You're making a typical social app for, that has forms, it has indexes, it has views. This is not something that you need to do solely in JavaScript. You can use HTML to do this, and you can add JavaScript to that. And how many of you guys are familiar with this term progressive enhancement or defensive enhancement? Okay, cool. Well, I'm going to explain it, and hopefully I can try and convince you why this is a good way to approach app development, and also how you do this in App Engine. Oh yeah, the slide. This is an escalator, and there's a really funny quote by a guy named Mitch Hedberg who says that an escalator is great. When it breaks, it's still stairs, right? So this escalator, when it's got its little additional feature of having electricity, it works, and it keeps you from having to climb the stairs. But when it's broken, when electricity fails, the whole thing isn't suddenly useless. It's not now a closed elevator, right? You can still walk up these things and get where you need to go. And so think about building your web apps. Think about that. Think about user agents. Think about all the different kinds of weird browsers that are coming to your app that maybe aren't the fanciest, newest WebKit with the best JavaScript engine and awesome strict rendering support. Because it may be a crappy phone in some weird part of the world. It may be, a Chumby. It may be, it may be the awesome browser too. So, obviously this is an Ajax conference, and we're talking about making your app feel, sort of richer and more fun, and do things in line when you can. But think about, one thing I always do when I look at people's apps, if they're telling me that they're good web developers, I'll turn off JavaScript, right, and immediately see what happens. Does it still render as if it thinks JavaScript's there? I mean, have they written CSS that assumes the existence of JavaScript? Or likewise, turn off CSS, leave JavaScript enabled, and see what happens. I mean, these are kind of anecdotal things to do because not too many people are browsing Flickr with links, right? But it's still meaningful. Look at that and think of it's a good way to test that you're doing the right things building your app. So I think we have an example of this. I'm not sure if that's the next slide or not. Oh, well, I'm going to show you some code, but maybe go back to our demo, and I'll just show you what we did in our demo to make something that I'm going to call defensive enhancement. So if you go to Azure website, and so sign this guestbook page. So hit cancel here, and if you view the source of this page, so go to the sign this guestbook, if you can find that on there, just the text. So there it is. So this isn't a span that I'm adding an on-click handler to. This is an anchor, and it's got an href. And so let's go to this href, /greetings /create 8. So if we go to this in the app, this should be pretty obvious. It's just going to be a regular old web form, right? So this is obvious, right? But the point is that back there, so now let's go back and let's click the link. Instead, because we don't really want to send our user there. What we want to do is this, fancy inline form, right? A JavaScript dialog. We want to show them where they are. This is nice. You know what you're writing about. This is a good experience. But the point is that when you write this code, take JavaScript, grab an anchor tag, use an on-click handler, set it all up in JavaScript, and then do your magic. Prevent the href from being followed. But actually use the href. Use that href as the source of your JavaScript call. Don't write it in line in JavaScript. Let's say I change the way this HTML works, and I change that link because I decide create's a stupid name. I want to call it add now. Do I have to change that in 2 places? No. If I'm relying on the existence of href and programming against that, I can just, if it changes, it's no big deal. It's going to still work. So I'm going to show you some of the code that I actually wrote for this app in the handler, like the generic handler, for how you might think about doing this. So I'm importing the Django utility for simple JSON output, and in a GET request, I'm looking, are they requesting a different kind of output? By default, I'm going to assume HTML. But if it's JSON, I can set different headers. I can take this this template values object and do something different. I can write out simple JSON. Or I can assume that what they want to do is go to a template and render that template as HTML. So in my website's create example, I could say, follow this form and get a simple version of HTML without the rest of the site, or turn this form object into a JSON object and output that, or turn this index into an RSS feed. And if you design your app with this in mind, you'll actually have created a pretty simple API to your entire app from the beginning, every time you think about how you populate your template values. So, because obviously there's a bunch of different ways you could populate this thing, template vars, or what have I said? Yeah, template values. You could use, 10 different keys in there. You could use one key. But if you think about the fact that this might need to be consumed by other sorts of agents, then it'll help you decide how do you package this up and send it to your templates. And at the bottom, I'm just outputting an HTML template by default. And then in JavaScript, this is really basic, but I'm just saying grab the link item, and if XHR is supported and there's this link item on the page, hijack the click event and prevent default. That's the way to prevent the href from being followed. And in this case, then I send an XHR request to the href, get the HTML, and put it in line. So that's the bulk of what we had, and we really wanted to leave time to talk about user experience because in terms of App Engine, you guys have had a lot of time to talk about technology, but we wanted to talk about UX in that regard. So,
yes, if you have any questions, yeah.
And otherwise, we want to tell you thank you for coming to the conference. This is the last talk, and you've made it.
Yeah.
I do have when you're thinking about the user experience and developer and designer both working in the code, potentially, I'm kind of new to the Python Django stuff. I'm more of a Java developer, but there are some Java frameworks where you use XML namespaces and do valid XHTML documents where you still have the placeholders for the dynamic data insertion. That allows the designer to work with standard HTML editing tools, but still allows the developer to use a template that they can dynamically inject data into. I just wonder what your thoughts are about that. Did I explain it?
I think so. So you're asking about tooling around working with Django templates?
Yeah, you can't really take a Django template into an HTML editor because it's got all that template markup in it. Or maybe there's other special tools for doing that. Or
yeah, personally I use TextMate, and it's just a text editor. But I used to actually work on Dreamweaver, and I'm pretty sure since the templates themselves would show up as HTML, Dreamweaver has a mode. It's called design time style sheets. So if it's just HTML, the attribute values would just probably appear as bracket, bracket, whatever. But if you had HTML, you could use this design time style sheet feature, which basically adds a style sheet at design time, even though it's a fragment, and it would basically render properly.
Okay, well,
So you might want to look into that.
All right.
Are you asking about validation type tools too?
Well, you can actually put sample content in the XHTML, templates. Then it could actually be literally displayed in a browser and displayed properly with example data in it. So the designer can actually design basically a prototype of the template just using a browser.
Well, another thing you could do to make that very easy is send your designer the local data store file, and they just put it in /temp, and you've got this built-out default data quite available to them to do that sort of design.
Yeah,
okay. I know there's ways to do other things. I just wonder what your thoughts were on that topic. That's all.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think you were next, maybe, or was he next? Okay.
Okay. So you mentioned in the kind of anti-GUID bit that you were talking about the different user experiences that Google App Engine offers versus this kind of Java thing. What user experiences does the App Engine lend itself to? You mentioned this kind of normal social app.
Right. So to be fair, this isn't really an anti-GUID spiel. The defensive enhancement part is because you're not just looking at a JavaScript app. But you can use GUID with App Engine. App Engine is a platform. It doesn't really lend itself one way or another to one mode of development. And the point is, that's true right now with most platforms don't force you into a development model.
And do they make it easier to do it one way versus another?
Well, actually, so thinking about how easy it is to get a version ID and to actually program static asset delivery against that, I think it actually makes common tasks that so the converse to that would be write an Apache mod rewrite rule, for your assets. That's quite a bit harder than, putting this in the one app.yaml file, and that's something you can ship in the same directory. This isn't, in other words, so common web app developer problems are quite easy to solve. So I think in that way it lends itself to solving the problems you're probably going to have. It's not going to solve the problem of, you want to run Hibernate on top of this. Okay, that's not what it does.
Cool, thanks.
Have you discovered any interesting sort of tips and tricks to do with user agent sniffing in App Engine? I know you can do it through the OSDOT environs, but...
I don't have any tips and tricks for user agent sniffing beyond, the typical ones. I mean, you have a user agent string.
Sure.
If you look in the logs, and, you can do this in JavaScript too.
Yeah, cool, thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay.
Actually, I had one question.
Yeah.
In our previous session, which talked about the data store and making sure that you had entities mapped out correctly, one of the issues was the cost to write versus cost to read. Write's very expensive, read is inexpensive. So the design of your entity, how you structure your entities is extremely important. In your multiple website guestbook application, could you comment on how you've done your entity creations in the...
I think in this example, it's so simple that it's pretty negligible. We are writing to the data store before saving the data for real, so maybe it's not ideal in that regard. But I think it's in as much as it makes the user experience better, and that's the whole point.
Right.
Then it's negligible. And this is a very simple application.
Right.
So we didn't really come up with any barriers thinking about that.
Okay, but that would affect the user experience because of latency
Yes,
issues.
yes.
So I was just wondering if you had thought that through in your implementation. So.
Yeah, we the only real relationship we have is a website and a user, and in that case, it's very simple. This doesn't have more complex things like list entities or expandos.
Thanks.
Sure.
I have a question about the web framework. Which one is kind of better to use? Because I haven't done much Python development, like web application development, but I wonder, compare Django and also the web app provided by Google, do you have any feeling about compare those frameworks?
My feeling is that frameworks in general all have one drawback, and that's that you have to learn the framework too. So in that regard, they're all still some other thing you have to learn. That said, I don't have a preference. Just learn one of them or learn a couple of them, and whichever one feels like it follows your way of thinking, then I'd use that. If you were starting from scratch right now, use Django. Django's been very well tested. It ships in App Engine already. The bar to learning Django is pretty low. The documentation's really good. And that's actually the biggest thing to think about in frameworks is what's the community like? How active is it? And if you go on IRC today and you go into the Django channel on IRC, it's full of people who can answer your questions. And so I'd say that's a sign of a healthy community, and that's really what you're looking for, because you probably don't want to have to look through the source code, even though you will. Come up to the app. So,
well, that's what I'm thinking, because if you're planning to write a bigger application, so you want to choose a better web framework to use to start with, because you don't want to change in between, right? So
right. Yeah, it's annoying to have to change frameworks because you don't like the framework. No question. Yeah.
So you guys probably get this question a lot. It's just about scalability, and have you guys tested some of the engine? What are some examples of the sort of stress that the Google App Engine has been under, and the size and scale it can reach?
Well, I don't know if we...
Should we ask Ken to come up?
Yeah, Ken can answer that question much better.
Who also worked on the admin console in addition to doing all the load testing.
So we did extensive load testing before launch. If you saw my talk earlier today, I talked about how to do load tests and doing realistic numbers for those. As these guys mentioned, the admin console is itself an App Engine app, and during our launch and with open signups and everything, we've received an incredible amount of load. So that's a testament to the sort of website that you can build with App Engine.
Great.
Do any of you go work in user experience departments out of curiosity? A couple. Okay, cool. Right on.
Okay.
All right, well, thank you very much. Thanks for coming to
Thank you so much.
Google I/O.